If you really want to hear about it, the whole thing was a goddamn performance. It kills me honestly seeing your own parents acting like martyrs when they're really just thieves in cardigans. My name is Rachel Graham, and I walked into my childhood home expecting Christmas, but I walked into a financial trap. They were shivering in the dark, crying these big phony tears about being destitute while hiding millions offshore. It leaves you feeling hollowed out, realizing you weren't a daughter to them, just a credit score to be harvested. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. It began on the driveway under a bruised winter sky. The tires crunched over the hard-packed snow, a sound like dry bones snapping under heavy boots. It was the only noise in the car. Mark drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the winding driveway that led up to the house. The Connecticut winter had been cruel this year. The snow was old-crusted with ice and gray from the road salt piled high against the trunks of the dormant maples lining the property. It was Christmas Day, but the sky was the color of a bruised plum, dark and heavy with the threat of more snow. I looked up at the house. It was a sprawling Victorian monster, a structure of turrets and wraparound porches that had dominated my childhood. Usually on the 25th of December, the place blazed with light. My father, Frank Graham, believed in aggressive displays of wealth. He normally strung thousands of LEDs along the eaves and placed electric candles in every window, a beacon visible from the main road 2 miles away. Today the house was dark. It looked abandoned, a hollow shell sitting in the growing twilight. "It looks dead," I said. Mark didn't answer immediately. He slowed the car, easing it over a patch of black ice. He was a man of few words, a structural engineer who understood load-bearing limits better than anyone I knew. He had been quiet for the entire 2-hour drive from our apartment in the city. Beside him on the floor of the passenger side sat his battered leather satchel. He never brought work to my parents' house. He usually left his laptop and files at his office, preferring to endure the Graham family dynamics with a drink in hand and a polite, detached smile. Today the bag sat against his leg, heavy and full. "It's theater, Rachel," he said, finally killing the engine. "Remember that. They're my parents, Mark. They wouldn't lie about this." He reached over and took my hand. His grip was firm, grounding. "Just keep your eyes open, that's all I'm asking." We stepped out into the biting cold. The wind cut through my coat, seeking skin. I shivered not just from the temperature, but from the familiar tightening in my chest. It was a specific anxiety reserved for this driveway, a regression to the feeling of being 12 years old and failing a math test. I was 28 now. I ran a successful landscape architecture firm. I paid my own bills. Yet standing in the shadow of that dark house, I felt small. The front door was unlocked. We walked in, and the first thing that hit me was the temperature. It was freezing inside. The thermostat in the hallway usually read a stifling 72 degrees. Today the air inside was stagnant and cold, smelling of dust and old wood. "Hello?" I called out. My breath ghosted in the air. "In the den," a voice replied. It was my brother Caleb. We walked through the foyer. The house felt neglected. There was a layer of dust on the mahogany console table. The mirror above it was streaked. It wasn't messy exactly, but it lacked the polished, sterile perfection my mother Eleanor prided herself on. It felt like a stage set for a play about decline. In the den, the curtains were drawn. The only light came from a single lamp in the corner, and the weak glow of the television, which was muted. My father sat in his leather armchair. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and loud, a man who took up space. Now he was slumped over, staring at his hands. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, the collar unbuttoned, his tie loose. On the side table, instead of his usual 18-year-old single malt, sat a plastic handle of generic blended whiskey. A half-empty glass sat sweating on a coaster. My mother was on the sofa. She was wrapped in a gray cardigan I hadn't seen in years. The cuffs were frayed, unraveling at the wrists. She held a tissue in her hand, twisting it into a tight rope. When she saw us, she didn't stand. She just looked up, her eyes rimmed with red, her face devoid of makeup. "Rachel," she whispered, "you came." "Of course I came," I said, moving to hug her. Her body felt rigid under the wool. "Why is it so cold in here?" "Oil is expensive," my father rumbled from the chair. He didn't look up. "We have to ration the heat. The tank is almost empty." Caleb was pacing by the fireplace. The hearth was cold, dead ash piled in the grate. Caleb was 32, the golden boy who was supposed to take over the world, but never seemed to find a job that suited his talents. He looked manic, his hair unwashed, his eyes darting between me and Mark. "Did you drive the Audi?" Caleb asked. It was his first sentence to me. "Yes," I said, stepping back from my mother. "Why?" "Good car. Holds value," he muttered, biting his thumbnail. "How's the firm? Q4 numbers were good, right? I saw you landed the contract for the municipal park." "Business is fine, Caleb," I said, wary. "Why are we talking about my business?" "Dinner is ready," my mother said, her voice trembling. "It's not much. I'm sorry. We didn't want to cancel Christmas." We moved to the dining room. The table was set with the everyday plates, not the fine china we used for holidays. In the center of the table sat a turkey that looked too small for the platter. It was dry, the skin pale and unappealing. Beside it were two bowls, one with canned green beans, the other with instant mashed potatoes that had already formed a crust. There was no wine, there were no fresh rolls. It was a meal of poverty, stark and shocking, in a room with silk wallpaper. We sat. The silence was heavy, broken only by the scrape of silverware on ceramic. I took a bite of the turkey. It was like sawdust. I swallowed it with difficulty, looking around the table. My father's hand shook as he lifted his water glass. My mother picked at her beans, her head bowed. Logic tried to assert itself in my mind. My father had been a corporate attorney for 30 years. He had been a partner. They had investments, properties, portfolios. Men like Frank Graham didn't just run out of money. They had safety nets for their safety nets. But looking at the frayed sweater, the cheap whiskey, the cold room, the logic faltered. The visual evidence was overwhelming. They looked defeated. "I don't understand," I said, putting my fork down. The clatter was loud in the quiet room. "What is going on? Why is the heat off? Why are you eating like this?" My father dropped his spoon. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders heaving. It was a sound of utter despair. "Frank, please," my mother sobbed. "Don't." "She has to know, Mom," Caleb said, his voice sharp, rising in pitch. He stopped eating, his eyes locked on me. "She's the only one who can fix it." "Fix what?" I asked. I looked at Mark. He hadn't touched his food. He was watching my father, his face completely blank, his eyes cold and hard. "We're ruined, Rachel," my mother said, the words coming out in a rush of breath. "It's all gone. Everything." The hook was in the water. I could feel the sharp point of it against my skin, but I didn't know yet how deep it would go. I just sat there shivering in the cold dining room, watching the people who had raised me crumble into dust. The sound of the dropped spoon echoed like a gunshot. It spun on the porcelain plate, smearing the gray gravy before clattering to a stillness. Frank didn't pick it up. He kept his hands over his face, his fingers digging into his scalp, messing up the thin silver hair that was usually combed with military precision. The silence that followed was thick, filled only by the wind rattling the single-pane windows in the kitchen. The draft ghosted across the floor, wrapping around my ankles. "Tell me," I said again. My voice sounded too loud in the room. "What is gone?" Frank lowered his hands. His face was a map of ruin. The capillaries in his nose were broken bright red against the sudden pallor of his skin. He reached for the plastic bottle of whiskey and poured 3 fingers into his water glass, skipping the ice. He drank half of it in one swallow. "A lawsuit," he rasped. The liquor burned his throat. I could hear the wet catch in his voice. "And a venture capital deal. It was a sure thing, Rachel. Biotech out of Palo Alto. I leveraged everything. The portfolio, the retirement accounts, the equity in the house. I wanted to leave you and Caleb something real, something substantial." He looked at the wall, unable to meet my eyes. The CEO was a fraud. The SEC froze the company's assets. Then the IRS came. They audited the last 5 years. They froze my personal accounts pending the investigation. I can't touch a dime. I have zero liquidity. We are in negative equity. Negative equity, I repeated. The term felt sterile mathematical. It didn't capture the smell of the cheap whiskey or the cold room. But the house, you own the house outright. You paid the mortgage off 10 years ago. I took a line of credit against it for the buy-in, Frank said. He stared at the dry turkey. A balloon payment structure. It was supposed to be short-term. I was going to pay it back as soon as the stock split. But the stock didn't split. The note is due, Rachel. The bank called it in. Caleb stopped pacing. He walked to the sideboard where a manila envelope sat amidst the dust. He picked it up. He held it like a weapon. They aren't just calling it in, Caleb said. He threw the envelope onto the table. It slid across the wood and stopped in front of me. They're seizing it. This is a foreclosure notice, but it's aggressive. Because of the federal investigation, the lender exercised an acceleration clause. They want the asset. They want us out. When? I asked. Tomorrow, Caleb said. December 26th. They send the sheriff at noon to change the locks. My mother let out a small, strangled sound. She pulled the frayed cardigan tighter around herself. My home, she whispered. I brought you home from the hospital to this house, Rachel. I planted those hydrangeas. I can't be homeless. I can't go to a shelter. I'm 60 years old. I looked at Mark. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, not eating, not drinking. He was watching Frank with a gaze that was unreadable. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a man watching a structural crack propagate through concrete. He didn't say a word. I opened the envelope. The papers inside were crisp and white, a jarring contrast to the dingy room. I read the top sheet. It was a terrifying document. It outlined a debt of nearly $2 million. But beneath that was a second document clipped to the front with a red paperclip. What is this? I asked. The solution, Caleb said. He pulled out a chair and sat down next to me too close. I could smell his sweat, sour and stale. I found a private lender, a hard money group. They specialize in distressed assets. They're willing to issue a bridge loan, $250,000. It pays off the immediate interest on the lien and stays the foreclosure for 6 months. It gives Dad time to unfreeze the accounts and refinance. I scanned the document. Promissory note. Guarantor agreement. The interest rate is 18%, I said, looking up. That's predatory. That's loan shark territory. It's a bridge loan, Rachel, Frank shouted. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. It's standard for high-risk liquidity. It's only for a few months. I don't have $250,000, I said calmly. You know that. My money is in the business. It's in equipment payroll inventory. We don't need your cash, Caleb said, tapping the paper with a chewed fingernail. We need your signature. The lender won't sign with Dad because of the freeze. They need a guarantor with clean assets, someone with a Tier 1 credit rating and a business with verifiable cash flow. I read the fine print. Paragraph 4, subsection B. In the event of default, the guarantor assumes full liability for the principal sum plus accrued interest. The lender reserves the right to attach liens to any and all personal and business assets held by the guarantor. It wasn't just a loan. It was a leash. If I signed this, and Frank didn't pay, and looking at the whiskey and the despair, I knew he wouldn't pay. They wouldn't just take his house. They would take mine. They would liquidate my firm. The excavators, the trucks, the nursery contracts, the reputation I had built brick by brick over 5 years, it would all be auctioned off to pay for a house I didn't live in. This puts my company at risk, I said. If you default, I lose everything. I lose my payroll. My employees lose their jobs. We won't default, Frank roared. He stood up, knocking his chair back. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. I am Frank Graham. I have never defaulted on a debt in my life. This is a temporary cash flow problem. Are you saying you don't trust me? After everything I paid for your tuition, that semester in Florence, the down payment on your first condo. Frank, stop yelling. My mother wept. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she sought mine. Her skin was dry like paper. Rachel, please, look at this house. It's our family history. Do you want to see us on the street? Do you want to drive away tomorrow, knowing the sheriff is dragging your father out by his coat? I need to talk to a lawyer, I said. I pushed the paper away. I can't sign this tonight. I need my attorney to review the liability clauses. There might be a better way. Chapter 11. Bankruptcy protection, maybe. There is no time for lawyers, Caleb snapped. He shoved the paper back in front of me. Look at the date on the term sheet. The offer expires at midnight tonight. The lender closes their books for the year. If we don't fax the signed notarized copy by 11:59 p.m., the deal is dead. The house is gone. That doesn't make sense, I said. Banks don't work like that. It's not a bank, Caleb spat. It's private equity. They make their own rules. Stop thinking like a landscape gardener and think like a Graham. We are in a crisis. Don't be a monster, Rachel, my mother said softly. The word hung in the cold air. Monster. If you don't do this, my mother continued, wiping her eyes with the napkin, it's a choice. You are choosing to let us be destroyed. You are choosing your tractors and your bank account over your own flesh and blood. I looked down at the paper. The black letters seemed to swim. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. American culture drilled it into you. Individual success is the goal, but family is the bedrock. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but you never leave your people behind. If I walked away, I would be the rich daughter who let her parents freeze. I would be the villain in the town gossip for the rest of my life. I looked at the pen Caleb had placed next to the paper. It was a heavy Mont Blanc, one of my father's old favorites. I faltered. My logical brain was screaming. The math was wrong. The timeline was manufactured. A midnight deadline on Christmas Day. It was absurd, but the emotional brain, the part of me that was still the little girl wanting her father's approval, was louder. Just sign it. Caleb urged, his voice dropping to a whisper. We fax it. It's done. We save the house. Dad gets his money in January, pays off the loan. You never hear about it again. You're the hero, Rachel. You save Christmas. I picked up the pen. The resin was cold against my fingers. Think about it, Rachel, Frank said, leaning on the table, his breathing heavy. Family acts for family. That's the code. You have the ability to stop this pain. You have the power. Why would you withhold it to protect a business ledger? It's not just a ledger, I said weakly. It's my life's work. And we are your life's origin, Frank shouted. I uncapped the pen. I looked at the signature line, Guarantor Rachel Graham. I looked at Mark again. He hadn't moved. He hadn't blinked. His eyes were fixed on Frank, dissecting him. Mark was the most resilient man I knew. He had grown up with nothing, built a career on hard math and absolute truths. He valued freedom above all else, the freedom from debt, the freedom from leverage. He knew what this signature meant. It was a chain. He saw me looking at him. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He just shifted his gaze from Frank to the paper, then to my hand, and finally to my eyes. The connection was electric. In the silence of that freezing room, amidst the smell of stale gravy and fear, he was the only thing that felt real. Mark, I asked. What do you think, this is family business, Caleb interrupted, stepping between me and Mark. Mark is a guest. He doesn't get a vote. He's my husband, I said, my voice hardening slightly. He gets a vote on my financial ruin. He's an engineer, Frank scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. He doesn't understand high finance. Mark slowly turned his head. He looked at Caleb, then at Frank. He reached down to the floor and picked up his leather satchel. He set it on the table. The heavy thud it made was louder than the spoon had been. I understand leverage, Mark said. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. It was the voice he used when telling an architect that a beam would collapse. And I understand load paths. Stay out of it, Caleb warned, his face flushing. Rachel signed the damn paper. We have 3 hours. I held the pen over the paper. The tip hovered millimeters from the line. The pressure in the room was suffocating. My mother was weeping into her hands. Frank was breathing like a dying bull. Caleb was vibrating with adrenaline. Please, my mother whispered. Save us. I lowered the pen. The ink touched the paper, bleeding a tiny black dot into the white fiber. Don't sign it, Rachel, Mark said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Frank stood up straight, his face purple. Get out, he snarled at Mark. Get out of my house. Mark stood up. He was 3 inches taller than Frank and 20 years younger. He didn't back down. He didn't shout. He just picked up his satchel and walked toward the living room, trailing the heavy power cord of his laptop, which he had pulled from the bag. I said get out, Frank yelled. Not yet, Mark said, walking toward the 60-inch smart TV mounted above the cold fireplace. Not until she sees the load path. I looked at the dot of ink on the paper. I looked at Mark's back. The pen felt like lead in my hand. I capped it. What are you doing? Caleb demanded, chasing after Mark. Showing you the reality, Mark said. He reached behind the TV and yanked the HDMI cable from the cable box. I capped the pen. The click was sharp, a small mechanical finality in the chaotic room. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy and numb as if the blood had drained out of them to fuel the panic in my chest. I walked into the living room, drawn by the strange tableau of my husband dismantling my father's entertainment system. Mark had the HDMI cable in one hand and his laptop in the other. He moved with the efficient, unhurried grace of a man who worked with steel beams and concrete. He wasn't frantic, he was methodical. He set the laptop on the dusty coffee table, blowing a cloud of gray grit off the surface before opening the lid. The screen glowed blue, illuminating his face from below, casting deep shadows in his eye sockets. Mark, stop this, I said. My voice was thin. We are leaving. We're just going to leave. Not yet, Mark said, his fingers flying across the trackpad. You need to see the architecture of the lie. Frank charged into the room. For a man who claimed to be crushed by the weight of the world, he moved with surprising speed. He grabbed Mark's shoulder, his thick fingers digging into the wool of Mark's coat. This is my house, Frank bellowed, his face inches from Mark's. The smell of the cheap whiskey was overpowering, a cloud of ethanol and decay. You have no right, I'll call the police, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply looked at Frank's hand on his shoulder, then up at Frank's eyes. Go ahead, Frank, Mark said. His voice was level, quiet, dangerous. Call the police. While they're on the way, I'll call the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I have the number saved. Do you want to explain the acceleration clause to them? Frank froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old dough. His hand dropped from Mark's shoulder. He stepped back, breathing hard, his eyes darting to the laptop screen. Caleb was standing in the doorway, chewing on his cuticle until it bled. He looked like a trapped animal, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Connect it, Mark said to himself. He jammed the HDMI cable into the port. The 60-inch television above the fireplace flickered. Static hissed, then the screen went black, then bright blue. A moment later, it mirrored Mark's desktop. It was a stark, cluttered landscape of PDF files and spreadsheets. What is this? My mother asked from the hallway. She was holding onto the doorframe, looking frail and terrified. It's the truth, Eleanor, Mark said. He didn't look at her. He controlled the cursor on the big screen. He opened the first folder. A document filled the television. It was a scanned image, high resolution. It was a certificate of incorporation. Read it, Rachel, Mark said. I stepped closer to the TV. The light from the screen was cold, bathing the room in an artificial daylight that made the dust motes dance. North Star Holdings, LLC, I read aloud. Registered agent, Trident Trust Company, Grand Cayman. A shell company, Mark said. Standard offshore vehicle, used for asset protection, used for anonymity. Now look at the date of incorporation. I looked at the timestamp in the corner. September 15th of this year. 3 months ago, Mark said. Right when Frank says the bad venture capital deal happened, right when the lawsuit started. So, Caleb interrupted, his voice cracking. So Dad tried to start a new business to recover our losses. Is that a crime, trying to rebuild? He didn't start a business, Mark said. He dug a hole to bury the treasure. Mark clicked the next file. It was a spreadsheet dense with numbers, columns and rows of transaction data. It looked like the back end of a bank statement, but deeper, the kind of raw data you get from a subpoena or a forensic leak. Where did you get this? Frank whispered. The fight had gone out of him. He sank onto the arm of the sofa, staring at the screen with the dull horror of a man watching his own autopsy. You aren't careful, Frank, Mark said. You used the home Wi-Fi for the transfers. You didn't use a VPN. I didn't need a warrant. I just needed to look at the packet logs coming out of this house for the last 90 days. I hired a specialist to decrypt the traffic. It took him 2 days. Mark highlighted a row in yellow. September 20th, Mark narrated. Wire transfer from Frank Graham, Primary Savings Bank of America. I looked at the number. It was a staggeringly large figure. $4,200,000, I whispered. Destination, Mark said, moving the cursor to the right. North Star Holdings LLC via Correspondent Bank in New York. My stomach turned over. The room seemed to tilt. $4 million. They had told me they couldn't afford heating oil. They had fed me dry turkey and canned beans. My mother had wept about being homeless while $4 million sat in a Caribbean account. October 1st. Mark continued, highlighting the next block. Transfer of the deed to the summer cottage in Martha's Vineyard. Quitclaim deed to North Star Holdings. Sale price $10. October 15th, Mark said. Transfer of the vintage Porsche collection. Title changed to North Star Holdings. Mark turned to me. His face was grim. They stripped the carcass, Rachel. They liquidated every liquid asset they had, and they moved the ownership of the hard assets into the shell company. They made themselves look destitute on paper. The bankruptcy is a simulation. It's a firewall. Why? I asked. I turned to my father. He was staring at the floor. Why would you do this? Why tell me you're broke? To protect it, Frank shouted, suddenly looking up. His eyes were wet, but not with sorrow, with rage. The lawsuit was real, Rachel. That part was true. The investors were suing me. If I kept the money here, the courts would have frozen it. They would have taken it all. I had to move it. I had to hide it to save it. So you committed fraud, I said. You hid assets to defraud creditors. I protected the family legacy, Frank roared. I earned that money. It's mine. Why should some judge give it to a bunch of whining tech investors? And the mortgage? I asked, pointing to the paperwork still on the dining room table. The foreclosure, the hard money loan, Mark answered for him. That's the genius of it, he said, his voice dripping with disgust. The lien on this house, the one they say is foreclosing, it's held by North Star Holdings. Frank put a lien on his own house payable to his own shell company. I felt dizzy. I don't understand. He is foreclosing on himself, Mark explained. It washes the title. If North Star forecloses on the house becomes the property of the offshore LLC. It's untouchable by the U.S. courts. But there's a cost. The transaction fees, the lawyers in the Caymans, the bridge financing, to keep the lights on while the assets are frozen. He can't touch the $4 million because it would flag the IRS. He's asset-rich, but liquidity poor until the dust settles. Mark stepped closer to me. That's where you come in, Rachel. They didn't need your money to save the house. The house was never in danger. They own the company that is taking the house. They needed your credit to get a clean cash injection, the $250,000 to pay their living expenses, and the legal fees for the shell company for the next 6 months. They wanted you to take on $250,000 of debt at 18% interest so they could live comfortably while they waited for the statute of limitations to run out on their fraud. I looked at Caleb. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the screen calculating. "You knew," I said to him. Caleb shrugged, a twitchy, nervous gesture. "It's smart business, Rachel. Look, Dad's right. The system is rigged. If he didn't move the money, he'd lose it. We'd all lose it. The inheritance. Your inheritance." "My inheritance," I repeated flatly. "Yes," Caleb said, gaining confidence. "Who do you think this is for when they die? North Star passes to us. Tax-free. Offshore. It's generational wealth, Rachel. We just needed a bridge. We just needed you to carry the weight for 6 months. You have the credit score. You have the clean business. It was the only way to get the cash without triggering a federal audit." "So you decided to guilt-trip me," I said. The anger was starting to rise now, a cold, hard tide replacing the shock. "You staged this poverty play. The cold house, the canned vegetables, the frayed sweater." I looked at my mother. She had stopped crying. The tears had been real, perhaps born of stress, but the performance was undeniable. She pulled the cardigan tight, but her eyes were hard now. Calculation had replaced sorrow. "We did what was necessary," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. "You have no idea what it costs to maintain this life, Rachel. You with your dirt and your plants. You don't understand the world your father operates in. It's a war. We were protecting the family." "You called me a monster," I said, "because I hesitated to sign a loan that would have bankrupted me." "You wouldn't have gone bankrupt," Frank grunted. "I would have paid it back. Once the heat died down, I would have wired the money from the Caymans. You would have been fine." "And if you got caught?" Mark asked. "If the IRS pierced the veil, they would seize the Cayman accounts. You'd have zero liquidity. And Rachel would be left holding a $250,000 bag with an 18% interest rate. Her business would be liquidated. You bet her life on your criminal scheme." Frank waved his hand. "Risk is part of business." "Not with my life," I said. "Not with my freedom." I looked at the screen one last time. The numbers were crisp and clear. $4,200, $1,000, $1,000. It was more money than I would make in 20 years of designing gardens. It sat there glowing in the dark room, a testament to their greed and their absolute lack of respect for me. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a resource. I was a credit score to be harvested. I was collateral. "Turn it off, Mark," I said. "I've seen enough." "Wait," Caleb said, stepping forward. "Rachel, think about this. Really think. If you walk away, the bridge loan falls through. Dad can't access the cash. He can't pay the lawyers. The shell structure might collapse. If the creditors find the money, we lose it all. $4 million. Gone. If you sign, we keep it. We all win. Just sign the paper. Don't be self-righteous. Be smart." He was appealing to my greed now. He thought I was like them. He thought that if I knew the pot was big enough, I would want a cut. I looked at the dining room table where the promissory note lay next to the dry turkey. I looked at the pen. "You're right, Caleb," I said. "It is about being smart." I walked back into the dining room. They watched me, hope flickering in their eyes. They thought the revelation of the money had changed the equation. They thought I wanted in on the heist. I picked up the document. I held it in both hands. The paper was heavy, expensive bond. "You have $4 million, I said, my voice carrying into the living room. "And you served me canned beans on Christmas." "It was for the effect," Frank called out. "To make you understand the urgency." "I understand," I said. "I understand perfectly." I ripped the paper in half. The sound was loud, tearing through the air like fabric ripping. "Rachel!" Caleb screamed. "No!" I put the two halves together and ripped them again. Quarters, then eighths. I tore the guarantor agreement into confetti. The heavy paper resisted, hurting my fingers, but I didn't stop until it was just a pile of jagged scraps. I walked over to the serving platter. I dropped the handful of paper onto the cold, dry turkey. It looked like snow falling on a dead landscape. "There is your urgency," I said. I turned back to the living room. Mark had already unplugged the laptop. The TV was black again. The blue light was gone, returning the room to the dim, cold gloom of the false poverty. "We're done here," I said to Mark. "You're killing us," Frank shouted, struggling to get out of the sofa, his face a mask of purple rage. "You ungrateful little bitch, I made you, I paid for everything you have. You paid for nothing," I said, feeling a strange, icy calm. "You bought things, there's a difference, and now the bill is due." I walked past Caleb. He reached for my arm, but Mark stepped in between us. Mark didn't touch him. He just occupied the space, a solid wall of indifference. Caleb shrank back. "Let's go," Mark said. We walked toward the door. The air in the house felt even colder now, if that was possible. It was the chill of a tomb. We had opened the coffin and seen the rot inside, and now we were sealing it back up. The shreds of the guarantor agreement settled onto the dry skin of the turkey-white confetti against the pale, overcooked meat. It was an image of absurd domestic ruin. For a moment, the only sound in the house was the humming of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a mechanical drone that underscored the silence in the dining room. Then the explosion came. Frank didn't just shout. He erupted. He lunged across the space between the living room archway and the dining table, his movement clumsy and violent. He gripped the back of a heavy oak chair, his knuckles turning the color of bone. He looked at the ruined papers, then at me. The vein in his forehead was throbbing, a thick blue worm beneath the skin. "You stupid, arrogant girl," he roared. Spittle flew from his lips. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That was the bridge. That was the lifeline. The lifeline to your fraud," I said, my voice steady, though my knees were shaking. "The lifeline to your Cayman account." "It's my money!" Frank screamed, and there it was, the admission. He didn't deny the account. He didn't try to say Mark was wrong. The pretense of bankruptcy vanished, replaced by the naked fury of a man who believes he has been robbed of what is rightfully his. "I earned every cent of it. I spent 30 years in that firm. I billed 3,000 hours a year. I missed your birthdays. I missed your plays. I gave my life for that capital. Why should I let them take it? Why should I let the government bleed me dry because of a bad deal?" "Because that's the law, Frank," Mark said from beside me. "You don't get to opt out of the system just because you feel entitled." Frank swung his head toward Mark, his eyes wild. "Entitled? You talk to me about entitlement. Look at her." He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Look at this princess, who paid for the private school, Rachel, who paid for the orthodontist, who paid for the writing lessons, who wrote the check for $50,000 to start your little gardening business." "It's a landscape architecture firm," I said instinctively. "It's digging in the dirt," Frank spat. "And I paid for the shovel, I paid for everything. You are an investment, Rachel. We poured resources into you for 30 years. And now when the market turns, when we need a return on that investment, you cut and run. You think that's moral. You think that's right." It was a transaction. He was saying the quiet part out loud. The love, the support, the family values, it was all just a balance sheet. I was a bond that had matured and he was trying to cash out. "I am not a stock option, Dad," I said. The word dad felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign object. "I'm your daughter. You were supposed to protect me, not use me as a shield for your tax evasion." "We were protecting the family," Caleb shouted. He had moved to stand next to Frank, forming a united front. The dynamic was clear now, the men against the woman. "Don't you get it? If Dad goes down, the name is mud. The legacy is gone. This was smart business, Rachel. It was a strategic insolvency. If you had just signed the paper, we would have been in the clear in 6 months. I would have handled the payments. You wouldn't have lost a dime. You would have handled it." I looked at my brother. He was sweating, his shirt stained at the pits. "You've never handled anything in your life, Caleb. You would have missed a payment, or the IRS would have frozen the transfer, and the hard money lender would have come for my business. You were gambling with my livelihood because you didn't have the guts to gamble with your own. I don't have the assets, Caleb whined. You're the one with the assets. Because I worked for them, I said. My mother Eleanor stood up from the table. She moved slowly, but the frailty was gone. The performance of the shivering broken woman evaporated. She smoothed the front of her frayed cardigan, her movements precise and cold. She walked over to the sideboard and picked up a pack of cigarettes I hadn't noticed before. She lit one, the flare of the lighter illuminating a face that was hard, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. She took a deep drag and exhaled a stream of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "Stop shouting, Frank," she said. Her voice was dry and sharp. "She's made her choice." She turned her eyes to me. They were the same blue as mine, but there was nothing behind them. No love, no maternal instinct, just a cold assessment of a failed asset. "I thought we raised you better," Eleanor said. "I thought we raised you to be loyal. But I see now that we indulged you too much. We made you soft. You care more about your husband's opinion and your precious reputation than you do about the roof over your parents' heads." "The roof isn't in danger, Mom," I said. "Mark showed us the deed transfer. You own the company that's foreclosing on you. You aren't losing the house. You're just washing the title." "It's the principle, Rachel," Eleanor said, tapping ash onto the floor. "It's the fact that you hesitated. The fact that you required proof. A good daughter trusts. A good daughter signs the paper because her father asks her to. You failed the test." "The test?" I laughed, a short, sharp sound that hurt my chest. "You staged a play. You starved yourselves. You froze the house. You sat there crying, Mom. You cried real tears to manipulate me into signing a loan that could have ruined me. That's not a test. That's a con." "It was necessary," she said, shrugging. "You're too independent. We knew you'd ask questions. We had to create leverage, emotional leverage. It's the only thing you respond to anymore." I looked at them. The three of them. Frank, red-faced and panting, clutching the chair like a weapon. Caleb shifting and twitching, a coward hiding behind his father's rage. Eleanor smoking with the detached cruelty of a general who has sacrificed a pawn and is annoyed that it didn't die quietly. They were strangers. I had spent my entire life trying to please them, trying to live up to the Graham standard, trying to be worthy of the love I thought they were withholding, because I wasn't quite good enough. But there was no love to withhold. There was only potential utility. I wasn't a person to them. I was a resource to be mined. "You aren't destitute," I said. My voice was quiet now, but it carried in the cold room. "You aren't poor. You aren't victims." I looked at the confetti on the turkey one last time. "You're just hollow," I said. "You're empty shells. There is nothing inside you but greed and fear. You have $4 million in the Caribbean, and you're the poorest people I have ever met." "Get out!" Frank bellowed, smashing his hand against the wall. A picture frame, a photo of me at my college graduation smiling, flanked by two proud parents, rattled and fell. The glass shattered on the hardwood floor. "Get out of my house! You are dead to us! Do you hear me? Dead!" "I hear you," I said. I looked at the shattered glass. I didn't feel the urge to pick it up. I didn't feel the urge to fix it. That was the old Rachel, the fixer, the gardener who tried to make things grow in salted earth. The new Rachel looked at the broken glass and saw it for what it was, garbage. "Come on." Mark set his hand on my back. "Yes," I said. "Let's go." We turned away from the dining room. We turned away from the cold fireplace and the blue screen of the television and the smell of dust and lies. We walked toward the heavy front door, the wood swollen with the cold. Behind us, Frank was still shouting, listing the costs, the invoices, the debts he believed I owed. But his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. It was just noise. It was the sound of a crumbling empire. I reached for the brass handle. It was freezing against my palm. I turned it, and the door swung open, revealing the night. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and shocking, but it felt clean. It didn't smell of dust or cheap whiskey or the stale recycled air of a dying house. It smelled of ice and pine needles and the vast, indifferent silence of winter. Behind me, the front door was still open. Frank was standing in the threshold, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway. He was shouting into the darkness, his voice cracking with the strain. He wasn't yelling names anymore. He was reciting a ledger. 12,000 for the braces! He screamed, his breath puffing out in white clouds that were immediately snatched away by the wind. 8,000 for the piano lessons you quit. 4 years of private college. We have the receipts. Rachel, we have the receipts. He was invoicing me for my childhood. He was trying to tally the cost of raising a daughter so he could bill me for the difference. It was the final proof, if I needed one, that I had never been a person to him. I had been a capital expenditure. I had been an asset class that failed to yield the expected dividend. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop walking. Hemingway wrote that the dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. I kept my words below the surface. I let the crunch of my boots on the snow be my only reply. I walked toward the car, my head down against the wind, matching my stride to Mark's. We reached the Audi. It looked alien in this setting, a machine of sleek black metal and glass, sitting amidst the neglected, overgrown driveway. It was a piece of the life I had built, the life they despised, because they couldn't control it. Mark opened the passenger door for me. The courtesy felt heavy, significant. It was a gesture of protection. I slid onto the leather seat. It was freezing stiff with the cold. I pulled the door shut. The heavy thud cut off Frank's voice instantly. It was as if someone had thrown a switch. 1 second the air was filled with the rage of a desperate, greedy man. The next there was only the sealed, muffled silence of the cabin. Mark walked around the front of the car. I watched him through the windshield. He moved methodically, checking the ground for ice, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He got in and shut his door. He didn't look at the house. He pressed the ignition button. The engine purred to life, a low, steady vibration that hummed through the floorboards. The dashboard lit up a constellation of soft red and white lights. It felt like the cockpit of a spaceship, a vessel designed to take us away from a hostile planet. "Seat heater," Mark said quietly, reaching over to press the button on the console. "Thank you," I said. He shifted the car into reverse. The backup camera flickered on, showing a distorted fisheye view of the Victorian house looming behind us. I saw Frank still standing in the doorway, a small, dark figure gesticulating at the empty yard. Then Mark shifted into drive, and the image vanished, replaced by the dark tunnel of the driveway ahead. We moved forward. The tires crunched over the snow, finding traction. The headlights cut twin beams through the gloom, illuminating the gnarled trunks of the maples and the stone walls that lined the property. We were moving away. With every revolution of the wheels, the house became less real. It was fading into the past, becoming just a structure, a pile of wood and stone, where some people I used to know lived. The heat began to kick in, blowing warm air against my frozen hands. I rubbed them together, trying to work the stiffness out of my knuckles. The physical cold was retreating, but a different kind of chill lingered in my stomach. "You knew?" I asked. I didn't look at him. I watched the snow flying past the window, mesmerizing streaks of white in the darkness. "I suspected," Mark said. His eyes were on the road. "The math never added up. Frank is too proud to be poor. If he was really broke, he wouldn't have invited us. He would have hidden it. He would have starved in the dark alone before he let you see him fail. The fact that he made a show of it, it felt wrong." "So you hired someone 3 weeks ago," Mark said. "A forensic accountant I use for commercial liability cases. I asked him to run a background check on Frank's public filings. He found the shell company registration. Then we traced the IP addresses for the transfers." "You waited until tonight to tell me," I said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was a clarification." "I needed you to see it," Mark said. He slowed the car as we navigated a sharp curve in the driveway. "I could have told you. I could have shown you the papers at home, but you wouldn't have believed it. You would have thought I was attacking him. You needed to see them acted out. You needed to see the turkey and the sweater and the tears. You needed to see the manipulation in real time so the evidence would stick. I leaned my head back against the headrest. He was right. If he had told me in our apartment in the city, I would have defended them. I would have made excuses. They're old. They're scared. They don't understand. I needed the theater of the cold house to understand the depth of the betrayal. I'm sorry, Mark said. I'm sorry I had to let it happen. Don't be, I said. You saved me. You saved us. We reached the end of the long driveway. The stone pillars that marked the entrance to the Graham estate stood like sentinels in the snow. Mark stopped the car at the stop sign. To the left and right, the main county road stretched out. It had been plowed. While we were inside playing our parts in my father's tragedy, the county plows had come through. The road was scraped down to the black asphalt, wet and shining under the moonlight. The snowbanks were pushed high on the sides, creating a clear, open channel. Which way? Mark asked, though he knew the answer. Home, I said. Away from here. He turned the wheel. The car pulled out onto the main road. The tires hummed on the wet pavement, a smooth, steady sound after the crunching of the gravel. We picked up speed. The dark woods fell away, replaced by the open road. I took a deep breath. The air from the vents was hot now. I unzipped my coat. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of lightness. The debt was gone. Not the financial debt that had never been mine, but the emotional debt. The obligation. The heavy, suffocating burden of being the good daughter, the savior, the retirement plan. It was canceled. I had walked out the door, and the contract was void. I placed my hand on my stomach. It was a subconscious gesture, something I had started doing only a few days ago. We hadn't told them. We were going to tell them tonight after dinner over brandy. You're going to be grandparents. That was the plan. I kept my hand there, feeling the warmth of my own body through the wool of my sweater. I thought about the child growing inside me. It would never know the cold of that house. It would never know the manipulation, the guilt, the ledger of costs. It would know warmth. It would know truth. It would know that family is the people who protect you, not the people who consume you. Are you okay? Mark asked, glancing over at me. I looked at the road ahead. The headlights pushed back the night, carving a path through the darkness. The snow was still falling, but it couldn't touch us. We were moving too fast. We were moving forward. I'm free, I said. Mark reached over and took my hand. We drove on into the winter night, leaving the rot behind us, disappearing into the clean, cold dark. The engine hummed a final note of finality as the taillights vanished into the Connecticut frost, leaving the Graham legacy to freeze in its own hollow garden. If you found Rachel's choice as powerful as we did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. Let us know what you think of the parents' scheme in the comments. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.